So it's the next day, and I'm going to continue to attempt talking to myself daily until at least June 20th. Or not every day, but nearly every day. And I'm starting to feel kind of apathetic about this whole self-dialogue process. Maybe I'm tired of listening to myself. I'm not sure. Maybe it's also the process of taking this hearty nutritionals, and I think it's disidentifying me from everything that I was saying initially. It's sort of like if my brain manages to go back to so-called normal, or how it was before it was ever medicated in this way, it's almost like the whole experience is erased in a way, because that conversation is no longer a necessary conversation because it's not part of my life anymore. Years ago, when I had chronic fatigue syndrome, I would talk about it all the time, and that was my main topic of conversation. Whenever I would talk to people, I would tell them what I was going through and what I was doing and blah blah blah. But then once I was healed from chronic fatigue, once I finally figured out what to do to allow my body to heal, after a short period of time, I just didn't even talk about it. I didn't even think about it. And I remember talking to myself about this at one point or another, that would I even want to talk about this anymore? And I was talking about that when I was thinking about going to California and wondering, will I still talk about mental health? And then I wasn't planning on tapering off my meds, but it just turns out that's what I've decided to do based on things that have happened. And so if I taper off my meds and I'm taking the supplements and I'm not on the meds and I'm feeling okay, what is there to talk about? It's sort of like exiting the need to have that conversation. And not that I won't still. When I go back home, I want to find ways to help. But if I went back home, the conversation I would have with people would be different if I tapered off meds than if I don't taper off meds. So if I go back home and I'm off my meds and I'm doing fine, at least for the time being, there's no guarantee that it'll be forever. That's a different conversation than if I go back and I'm still on my medications. And I'm just wondering if my brain is decoupling from this conversation because of taking the nutrition. It's not so caught up in those narratives and having insights into these mechanisms when the mechanisms are no longer going on. And I'm not saying that I'm out of the woods. I'm just, in a way, having a few insights about this process of tapering off, and then maybe tapering off the need to have self-dialogue. And 6 years ago, I went to California for 3 weeks before I was medicated. And when I went back home, I was in the state of magic, and then I was medicated. So it would be cool if I went back to California like I have, and then go back home off medication, kind of like none of this ever happened. And of course it did, but it feels like going back to the beginning and then tapering off and then going back home. And imagine if I could be kind of like I was before I left. Doesn't mean life was perfect by any means, but I guess the prospect of coming off these meds is pretty huge for me. And I didn't have the greatest sleep last night. There were people talking upstairs really late, and I need quiet in order to sleep. So I'm hoping to get better sleep tonight and go from there. Yesterday I had a good day, and I found a place to charge the electric vehicle faster. So it's sitting over there right now charging. It's a ways away. And I just sat there drinking coconut water, which I shouldn't have done because part of having trouble falling asleep was that I had to pee really bad. And if I fall asleep before I have to go, it's not a problem. But if people keep waking me up and my bladder keeps filling up, then eventually it reaches the critical point where I have to get up and go. So if I keep up with this process, around 300 videos of varying lengths, and I'm starting to even doubt a lot of the things that I said. And not that I took anything that I've said seriously anyways, they're just random things, saying random things, and getting with the process of so-called bipolar and how we tend to have access to a lot of words, sometimes write them down. So I'm just really getting with that process and acknowledging that process and talking about some of the things I write down, because usually we only take seriously what we learn from other people who are professionals and who are in the know, and then if we write something about what they said and don't really change it very much and just reorganize everything people already said, then that's okay. But if we say things that are new that we just kind of get as a download, that's not okay. And these downloads aren't necessarily true or false or anything. They're just downloads and just sharing them. Just like a painter might do a painting, a bipolar person might have a lot of words that are kind of more like art than real fact. So why can't we be more artful with our words and really wonder and be creative? If it's translated into a song, well, that's okay. But it's not okay to just say it in a normal speaking tone like we do day to day and say whatever comes to mind. And that's something that comes to mind just might be from somewhere else than our own memory bank. So it's getting with that process, acknowledging that process, and it's likely that a lot of people who go through this process that's labeled bipolar could do something similar by just getting with some of the words they've had access to over time. And I used to get a lot more from editing my videos and listening to the insights that I say, because some of them I make up on the spot. And I find I'm not making up as much on the spot, and I'm not finding new insights while listening to what I said in the editing process. So it could be that my brain is just not learning as much from this process anymore, and that could be a good thing, because I don't necessarily want to sit and talk to myself all the time. Maybe I will change to a weekly video format or something, just to keep engaged in dialogue with myself, but not make it my one thing. And I was thinking a little bit about what I might want to switch to when the year is up on June 20th. And I definitely want to get back into taking care of my body. I've been eating a lot of simple carbohydrates like rice and chips and granola in the morning, and not a lot of greens and veggies. And part of that is financial, and part of that is laziness, and part of that is I haven't had access to a vehicle to really have a super healthy diet. But on June 20th, I'll have about a month left to go in California if I keep to the schedule I'm thinking. And maybe for that month, I'll just splurge, dip into my line of credit, and try to get my body in really good shape in terms of nutrition and take really good care of my body. Because by June 20th, I should be off my meds. So, great, by really spending, say, $500 in a month or something to buy really good quality food. And then when I get back home, I want to devote some time to my family, because I really miss them. I really miss them today. And if I wasn't tapering off meds right now, I might just leave. But I feel it would be good to stay down here where it's peaceful and quiet with good air and a lot of beauty around to complete the process. And also just go back and know that I did it, instead of being halfway there and then having to answer questions about, oh, if you're going to go see your psychiatrist and blah, blah, blah. So I'd rather just complete the process. And so part of taking care of my body would be just getting into optimal shape, using that month to really prepare for going back home. It's going to be noisier. There's going to be more people around, sort of. There's a lot of people around here too. There's going to be no stars. Yesterday I bumped into somebody and they asked, are we going to get to see all the stars tonight? And that question just made me feel so good, because that person was so excited to be around nature, and they were looking at all the bunnies running around, and I'm not really used to all the nature here because it's so beautiful, but that won't be back home so much unless I go and seek it out. And I might get a stand-up paddleboard or try it again a time or two to see if that's something I want to do. And the other thing I really want to focus on is altruism. And I've talked about altruism and how it becomes part of how the brain operates in map consciousness. And I think I want to learn through the process of altruism. And sharing some of this might be part of that altruism. I'll probably do some things to attempt to monetize it a little bit in some way, because if I can then devote my time to helping people that need help and not necessarily having to charge them. Like, I don't want to all of a sudden be some kind of coach or peer supporter that has to charge people who barely have anything. I'd love to be able to give people scholarships to take hearty nutritionals to come off medication if they can't afford it. Things like that. So I'm not sure how that'll work, but yeah. So when I get home, I'll focus on figuring out what to do with this content, if anything. I'll have about 300 videos, and maybe that'll be about 150 hours or something, and I could edit into something short and sweet, or I could listen to it and keep going with the process, or I could... There's a lot of different things that could be done with it, and the intention is to be helpful to other people. And watching my videos, I could go back to the beginning and find some of the clues of what I was talking to myself about in terms of what I might want to explore, because I totally forget. I feel like I'm going back to this blank slate, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just difficult to know what to do when one has such a blank brain. I was thinking about how we all have this inner chatter going on, and I was thinking about if psychosis is like accessing the collective chatter, and it gets confusing because we have thoughts that we think aren't ours, or that we're not thinking, that are coming from somewhere else, and it could just be the collective chatter. The brain manages to keep our chatter in this very narrow loop, but if it expands to something beyond that, all of a sudden we have access to more chatter than we are equipped to deal with. But in a way, it allows us to see other things that we added in the collective chatter, but we only have access to our little chatter. But our little chatter is part of the collective, meaning it still contributes to the collective chatter. And then if somebody gets access to the collective chatter, in a way they become responsible for resolving some of that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but we see that we do have greater responsibility beyond our own chatter. And that goes with increasing empathy as well. And I talked about that stuff before, but I don't think I ever thought about it in that way exactly. And I'm going to continue with my notebook to some extent. I feel like I don't want to talk about this stuff anymore, but I also feel like I want to acknowledge the process that I've been doing and continue with it, because even if it's sort of less energetic and it kind of tapers off, it could be good to do that and be sure that it's time to move on to something else. It's sort of like therapy. In general, the goal is to not be talking to the therapist forever, for the rest of one's life. So in the same way, I don't know if I need to continue to talk to myself like this. It'd be more fun actually to document altruistic activities or talk to people or something. And I have some notes from things that I read or things that I was listening to online, and some of it was with Dr. David Bohm, and I wrote down a few of his quotes. I think this was from the book Wholeness and the Implicate Order, or it could be from a talk he had with somebody named Nicholson or something. And I'll quote him, and I'm not trying to infringe on copyright, I just think he says a lot of genius things that might point people to reading a little bit of his work and remind myself to continue reading his work. He mentioned how feelings play over the whole body when there's a resistance to an action. So if we suspend an action, we feel a feeling, whereas if we did the action, we would no longer feel the feeling. I think he gave the example of punching somebody out. So if we stood there and we wanted to punch somebody, we'd have all these rage feelings, but if we actually did the punching, we would not feel the feelings, but we would do the action. And I related that to embodied mania and how it's important to act on the altruistic feelings. So it's important to do something about those feelings for humanity, that altruism and that passion, because that could be, in a way, why and how the energy builds up and becomes too much. It's because we're not able to act fast enough. And at first we usually do, but at some point it does end up building up. And part of it could be is that we need to share that energy. So that's why I think that it could be good for some of us to find some altruism projects to do together. Not that there isn't a lot of that out in the world, there is. But the difference is when we feel in our hearts and minds and beings that we need to act that way to actually be in alignment with our neurology, it's a little bit different of a movement, because then we're actually supporting each other to fully embody that together and not just working 2 hours volunteering for our resume each week as sort of a tokenistic thing in our life. It's really different. It's almost like supporting each other to be that way, otherwise we will explode and it will implode upon us and it will turn into a process against the personal me, because we're not able to embody that altruism and that we and that non-self, that egolessness. And David Bohm mentioned that thought creates mechanical pressure. Say, for example, the thought, he shouldn't have. If we're thinking that, it's creating mechanical pressure in the body, like we want to act out or say something or whatever. And I feel like that other mode, that mode of perception and action beyond thought, has a different kind of mechanical pressure. When the pure perception hits the clear mind screen, there's a calculation, there's a pressure, and that pressure of the clear perception actually creates the action. And it's a living calculation. It's not a calculation based on the past, such as he shouldn't have, so that means I'm going to punch him, etc. So that pressure and that perception action is really the dance with the universe. And these are the things that I'd like to get in alignment with again. So there's possibility for more degrees of freedom. And there was something interesting mentioned about how during a polygraph test, a lie detector test, it's detecting the increase in heart rate, the spike in the adrenal activity. And it's interesting that it was mentioned that in the polygraph test or lie detector test, it measures things like increased heart rate. And when the heart rate increases, it means it's a lie. And oftentimes in something like so-called psychosis, the heart rate increases. And so it feels like one is being reinserted into the lie of society and all of that structure. And when we're reacquainting ourselves with that, or being thrust into being reacquainted with that, we have all these reactions almost like we're reacting to a lie. And I'm not saying it's that. I just find it interesting that it's disturbing and it disturbs us. And it's the values of society, and we're reacting to being dipped back into that. So when we go into map consciousness, our whole nervous system becomes like a polygraph compass. All of our senses and our nervous system react to truth or falsehood, and we move away from the false structures of society and we move towards this other dimension that we're being led to. But the more we bump up against the structures of society, the more we're in retreat, the more we're turning away. And then eventually we're turning away so much that we start to think things like somebody's after us, or there's some kind of conspiracy, because we're in retreat. We're fearful, we're running away, and so the brain is telling us stories about what must be true to make our fear justified. But really, the structures of society are just that scary. And when we're in that space of being so sensitive, we can really feel it, whereas most people can't on a day-to-day basis. They just go about their own life. And I wrote down that even these words could be coming from that other dimension, in that they're like a direct download from being in touch with this other dimension to some extent. Thought builds up when we don't act. When we're really acting with the moment, we don't think. It's like our whole process, our whole movement is thought at that moment. It's not this little process in the brain talking around, moving us. It's we're moving with the thinking stuff, the mind stuff of the whole cosmos. It's like it's molding us and we're molding it, versus just having this thing go on and we're basically sleeping while walking around. And we're not molding the whole universe, we're just leaving a little trail of dirt as we walk along. There's got to be some kind of manic equilibrium